I want to talk today about taxation, specifically whether or not one can be a bona fide men's rights activist and also support some sort of taxation because they believe this taxation will have a net positive effect on our civilization. And this video is a response to those that have actually said, in my comment section, that anyone who supports taxpayer-funded domestic violence shelters for men some sort of commie infiltrator of the manosphere who cannot be a real MRA, so to speak. I mean, these are actual arguments being bandied about. Mainly, though, this video is going to function as a rebuttal to certain libertarian entities in our movement that have an overzealous insistence that the men's movement adhere to what I consider to be an unrealistic, unenforceable economic mantra that will never, in my opinion, be realistically achieved at least for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and that has never been achieved before in human history. Now, the people who I'm talking about are those that insist, when, for example, myself suggested in a previous video that I support taxpayer funds being dedicated towards domestic violence shelters for abused men, that, all taxation, any taxation is theft, as though the past few thousand years of organized civilization haven't existed within some kind of framework of taxation of its citizens. Now, I believe that as of right now, the best working model of civilization will include some sort of taxation of its citizenry, and the following is why. First, let's ask the question, are human beings inherently socialist creatures to any significant degree? And if so, why are we socialist? Now, the question I want to pose is whether or not there is an innate quality of human nature that makes us naturally predisposed, at times, to behavior we generally identify as socialism today. Now, what I want you to do is to think back to our Paleolithic ancestors living their nomadic lifestyles and, of course, at the mercy of Mother Nature, perhaps, 1 or 2 meals away from starvation at any given time. And think of how many countless millennia passed by with our species existing under these conditions. Now, imagine observing one of these nomadic groups and finding that it was discovered that a member of one of these nomadic tribes happened upon a food source and then neglected to tell the group about the food source, visiting this food source in secret for his nourishment only. Now then, imagine that the group discovers his deception. Now, being that the failure to disclose the location of a food source to the group or the tribe could very well have brought about the eventual demise of the tribe, I'd imagine that a crime this serious, selfishly hoarding food for yourself in this manner, could very well have been punishable by death. For the greater good of the tribe has been the reality and way of life for our species for the vast majority of existence up until the invention of agriculture a mere, 12,000 years or so ago. And that is to say that civilization, as we know it, is merely an eye blink in our species' history, and for a very, very, very long time, we existed in an environment where socialism was the norm for our species. So for the greater good of the tribe behavior, it's just not going to go away. It's part of our very DNA. Now, this isn't to say that human nature is rigidly socialist or rigidly, quote, capitalist. These are in fact just words that we ascribe to behaviors that are ingrained in the human condition and psyche. Human nature is in fact a complex mesh of several ingrained and sometimes competing drives. We're all staunch capitalists and we're all staunch socialists, depending on how convenient said capitalism or socialism is with respect to us. Now, going back to our Paleolithic friend, the one who hid the food source from his group, let's ask ourselves, what were his motivations for doing so? He may have had the job of scout for the group, and he may have seen that he would consistently find food sources and would of course have to consistently inform his tribe of the location of the food source, effectively sharing the fruits of his labor with a group who either didn't work as hard or wasn't intelligent enough to search as effectively as him, and thus he may have felt that he was entitled to more access to this food source as the rest of the tribe. And, voila, the first capitalist was born, or at least capitalism, the dynamics that fuel it, was born. Now, which side we as human beings and as a species overall express, either capitalism or socialistic tendencies, is obviously dependent on the environment around us. Now, if you were to imagine human beings embarking on a multi-generational excursion into deep space, the inhabitants of this mission would live under a government designed specifically for the environment of the ship. That is, this spacecraft they're going to live the rest of their lives on. And the most paramount priority of this group would be to ensure continuity of the mission and the safety of the inhabitants of the mission. There could be industry on the ship, there could be innovation and jobs and even a free market, but all of this would almost certainly exist under the umbrella of a wider socialist and even authoritarian regime. There would absolutely have to be a central authority dictating that, say, one could not manufacture certain weapons on board. Any weapon that could kill even 2 or 3 critical people, engineers or pilots, for example, would have to be heavily regulated. Because you see, the right to bear arms is actually, in the purest sense, a luxury. It's a luxury that decreases with the scale of damage that a weapon can exert. I've made the comparison before that, a venture capitalist, Bill Gates, for example, could easily put up the money necessary to acquire a working nuclear bomb. This will never happen, however, because a nuclear weapon has such a potential for destruction that we make it illegal to entrust it to one individual through a private sale. Again, it's for the greater good of the tribe in this scenario. The denizens of this spacecraft couldn't hoard food. They would have to dedicate the vast majority of the fruits of their labor toward the community and the ship. They wouldn't be allowed to refuse to vaccinate their children, for example. This environment would be unmistakably socialist in nature, and such a socialist setup would be the most natural human response to that environment. So try to keep in mind that when I say that socialism is sometimes natural, I'm arguing from the position that it can also be unnatural, and all of this is with respect to the environmental conditions at play. Let's say, for example, through a coordinated act of terrorism, every major government that comprises Western civilization was rendered impotent. And what I'm describing, to be clear, is a cataclysm that would bring about the end of Western civilization. Not an extinction event, the nations of the West would still retain the vast majority of its population, but the people of the West were left in such a situation where there was no functioning centralized government in place. What would happen? Well, various charismatic leaders would arise in the chaos that would ensue, and the people of the West would pledge allegiance to one or another of these leaders, and these leaders would compete for territory and resources until one of them, or a conglomerate or an oligarchy of them, eventually dominated the others. And it would be an incredibly violent time, but eventually, after this dominance was achieved, the violence would subside, and the people, that's right, the people, would ask and even demand that an interim government be installed while the process of establishing a permanent central governing authority could be achieved, and the people would set up a system of taxation for infrastructure and military. And that's why the founding fathers of this country, for all their talk about not letting the government get too large and for all their talk about the dangers of government, still explicitly included, the power of the state to tax its citizenry in the United States Constitution. Now, to the All Taxation is Theft Brigade, tell me why the founding fathers, who abhorred government oppression, still included the ability to tax in the founding document of this country. Maybe they're all communists, just out to steal your hard-earned dollars. Or maybe they understood that there has never been any successful nation or civilization that didn't exert some sort of taxation on its people. The Romans taxed, the British taxed, the Inca and Maya, even though they didn't have money, they taxed labor. The founding fathers knew that taxation must be kept to an absolute minimum, which I agree with, but that taxation for the functioning and welfare of a nation was necessary, and this is also why they felt the need to include the power to forcibly seize property in the Constitution as well via eminent domain. Now, what we're talking about is hardcore communism here. I mean, this is essentially the United States government saying we're going to take your private land away from you if your continued ownership of it poses a threat to the state. We're going to rationalize it by saying we gave you just compensation, when of course compensation by definition cannot be just if the person is forcibly compelled to give up his property. So my whole point here is that, I'm sorry, people, but taxation is here to stay. It's not going to go away. And you can sit up on your high horse pretending you're morally superior because you bleat out that all taxation is theft if you wish, but the rest of us have the daunting task of sustaining a civilization to worry about, and so the question at play here is what is the best, most efficient, and beneficial way to spend tax dollars? Minimize taxation and spend tax dollars efficiently is much more realistic than bleating out that all taxation is theft, and only one of them are actually likely to happen anytime in the near future. Okay? You get that? Now, for the record, I do think that a stateless society is possible, just not under our current state of technological advancement. I believe that we're going to have to innovate ourselves out of a dependency on the state, and that those innovations are at the very least decades away. And I'm going to talk about some of those innovations in my next video. But for now, let's just leave it at that for now, and we'll return to this socialism subject in a little bit. Before I get back to the topic of socialism, I want to discuss the path that humanity is going to take in the future and how our view of gender is going to factor into that. Now, when it starts becoming obvious that this path that we're heading on, where women are these proto-adults, these pre-adults that never actually graduate to adulthood, when it starts becoming apparent that our civilization simply can't be sustained for much longer while continuing on this path, then it's also going to become apparent that the generalizations we're making here on this channel, these are generalizations that have to be made. As a matter of fact, we can no longer afford to sit idly by and pretend that these generalizations aren't an important part of the assessment of our species and where we're headed as a species. The relationship between the genders and how it's going to change in the future is an important part of how we're going to plan the next 10 and 50 and 100 and even 1,000 years, and whether or not we're going to make it to the stars or languish in our tiny blue ghetto until we bring about our own demise. Of course, making these generalizations will be claimed to be overgeneralizations of women, but as I've said a great many times before, sometimes overgeneralizations are not only necessary, but completely devoid of hatred for the group being generalized. Let's talk about the atomic bomb, the invention of the atomic bomb for a second. When we invented the atomic bomb, we entered this new phase in our history as a species, knowing that really nothing else would ever be the same, that for the first time we had acquired the ability to bring about our own extinction. And I can't help but remember Robert Oppenheimer, director of the Manhattan Project, quoting the Bhagavad Gita, saying in response to the first detonation of a nuclear bomb,
"We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent." I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. Well, that's a pretty powerful statement, isn't it? I think he said that because he knew that humanity, having acquired this technology and having such a sometimes brutish and primitive and violent and short-sighted nature, may very well use these devices to destroy ourselves and our planet, and that immense care and compromise had to go into making sure humanity never allows that to become its eventual demise. Now, Robert Oppenheimer, a theoretical physicist, was not a stupid man. He was a highly intelligent, well-respected man that took part in one of the most massive and important scientific efforts our species has ever embarked upon. I think the only real comparable endeavor that we've taken was possibly going to the moon and perhaps the LHC and finally locating the Higgs boson. But here was this brilliant man, Robert Oppenheimer, making a massive generalization about humanity and the worst parts of our nature. I mean, this man was no misanthrope. He didn't hate humanity because he correctly identified the danger that mixing this technology with human nature can pose, and neither are we misogynists or haters of women for generalizing women and asking what eventual dangers allowing things like traditionalism and feminism to persist may spell out eventually for our species. What we fail sometimes to do in our movement, and even more so what traditionalists specifically fail to realize, is that we're trapped on an island. An island that seems vast to us, but in the grand scale, in the cosmic fugue, we're simply a tiny speck of dust floating around in a giant ocean of ink. And to put this into perspective, I want to use the comparison of the cargo cults of World War II. Now, the cargo cults of World War II were primitive indigenous tribes of primarily Melanesian peoples, inhabiting the various Melanesian lands that were included in the various theaters of World War II. And these people started seeing airplanes and they started encountering waste products of Western civilization. And then what they did was to actually start worshiping these planes as messengers from the gods. Now, these indigenous peoples, they may have actually benefited from this false belief in their airplane deities. And it may have actually created a more cohesive culture for these people to band around. And it may have even been living proof of the gods that their elders indoctrinated their children with.
Along this great ocean route, 10 cargo planes connect Hong Kong with Australia. They land each day at Port Moresby, and the cargo cult has its temples almost everywhere nearby. This is one. Its altar is standing 9,000 feet above sea level. The dummy plane is at the edge of the landing strip. At the other end, the control tower. The natives of the Rozo and Mikeo tribes are waiting for some plane to land on their strip, attracted by the bamboo model. They believe that planes come from paradise. Their ancestors sent them. But the white man, a crafty pirate, manages to get his hands on them by attracting them into the big trap of Port Moresby. You build your plane too, says the cargo cult doctrine, and wait with faith. Sooner or later, your ancestors will discover the white man's trap and will guide the planes on your landing strip. Then you will be rich and happy. They wait, motionless, searching the sky. There is no other world beyond these mountains, so the large birds that roar up there above the clouds cannot but come from paradise. There are only their ancestors in paradise. Therefore, only their ancestors can have built the planes. The spirits of the deceased cannot know the white men. Therefore, all those wonderful things that the planes carry were meant for their descendants. They've left the mission. They've forgotten their prayers. And here they are, waiting faithfully at the doorway to the sky.
And so in 100 or 1,000 years, if these cultures remained isolated, they may very well have formed traditions that allowed their people to enjoy a cohesiveness and closeness and a cultural identity around these airplanes that overall made their people a more close-knit and culturally strong group for generations to come. So again, these people actually worshipped and created a culture and a religion around these airplanes. And now these people may seem primitive to us, and we may see our sprawling, technologically advanced civilization as being a completely alien way of life, devoid of parallels and comparison, but put yourself in their position. Now, generating these traditions around these airplane gods, if it unfolded that way, one would have to take into consideration that this cultural identity that this tribe has formed itself around and its airplane deity will only provide those benefits, that cultural cohesiveness, as long as their tribe remains ignorant of what an airplane really is. That is, a machine invented by a vastly more technologically advanced culture they are ignorant of. Their cultural cohesiveness limits their advancement as a tribe and people because it's centered around ignorance of reality, even though it gives them some cohesiveness in the form of tradition and custom and religion. Now, both of these cultures, ours and theirs, belong, of course, to the same species, the human species. But one culture, our culture, who did not simply settle for the simple explanation of unexplained phenomena, like in their case, those flying metallic birds in the sky must be messengers of God. We didn't accept that as an explanation when we came across unexplained phenomena. And so because of that, Western civilization is so far ahead of this tribe in advancement that there really is no comparison, technologically speaking. And yet, ironically, Western civilization has done to itself exactly what this tribe is doing to themselves with its blind adherence to, archaic traditionalism. Our adherence to traditionalism has hampered our knowledge and understanding, and we've traded that in exchange for a cohesiveness and custom that provided some stability for a very long time. But we have reached a point now where we're just a much more advanced version of a cargo cult, where our culture is venerating a system of reproduction that is no longer working, and we stubbornly stick to our traditions, affixing some divine power to the monogamous family unit, when just like an airplane, it can be explained away by aerodynamics and by engineering, and traditionalism can be explained by simple, generalized rules about male and female biology. We are our own cargo cult, hampering our own development by stubbornly sticking to a traditionalist reproductive system. And so, speaking of traditionalism, I want to take a little bit of time to talk a bit more about women like Phyllis Schlafly and specifically Selective Service, and why it's so important that men understand the gravity, the sheer density of what this woman represents. This woman, Phyllis Schlafly, represents feminism and gynocentrism and misandry, all wrapped up in a neat little package of bullshit moral superiority. Now, hopefully it's becoming clear to a lot of you folks now that feminism isn't our only enemy, But I want you guys to really understand, I mean honestly understand, why I take such exception to traditionalists and women like Phyllis Schlafly. Now, as you know, Phyllis was instrumental in preventing the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment to the United States Constitution, citing that it would harm women by opening them up to being drafted via selective service. Now, let's just remind ourselves what selective service actually is. I'll ask you the question, what does selective service actually do? Well, I've said before that selective service is, in essence, an accounting of able-bodied men for the purposes of forcibly conscripting them in the event of war if volunteer forces are not sufficient. Selective service is a threat of enslavement sent unequivocally towards the male half of the population because the draft is, by its very definition, an act of enslavement. Point blank, you're either made to fight against your will or be imprisoned against your will. Therefore, it is slavery. Point blank. Period. Now, a way of comparing the type of slavery we're talking about here is like saying that, you want a record of all able-bodied black people in America when they reach a certain age, just in case we ever have to bring back slavery in the event of some kind of economic collapse. Selective service says we need a list of able-bodied men, just in case war breaks out. And with that said, I want to finally get back to the topic of socialism for a bit. Now, the interesting thing about women like Phyllis Schlafly is that here is a woman who decries socialism, who says that people like Barack Obama are ruining the country with all this socialism. And you know what? On that note, she may very well be correct. But women like her, if you'll notice, always are the first to say something along the lines of, the fact that the rich are better at navigating the free market and generating capital for themselves is not grounds for taxing them at a higher rate. That's socialism. She'll be the first to say something like that. And for the record, I actually happen to agree with that. But then, people like her will turn around and say that men should be threatened with forcible conscription, a form of slavery, merely because we happen to be better at soldiering. You see, at most, increased taxation of the rich for being better at acquiring capital deprives them only of a portion of their wealth. Whereas increased, and in this case sole conscripting of men, or at least a database dedicated just in case towards that end, will deprive men not only of a portion of their wealth, because keep in mind, these are potentially successful free market entrepreneurs we're taking out of the free market for service to a socialized military apparatus. But we're also depriving these men of life and limb in the very worst case scenarios. So again, this is why selective service matters. This is why it's important. Imagine a group of mobsters all of a sudden one day visiting all of the businesses in a bustling market district and demanding that each business owner provide a detailed accounting of their profits, and then they leave. And they leave the businesses alone. Now, each businessman is going to clearly interpret that as a symbolic gesture from the mob, saying that we don't quite need to shake you down just yet. But if times get hard enough, we know what you're making. And that's exactly what the state is doing to us. That's exactly what the state is doing to men. And Phyllis Schlafly is quite happy to support the worst kind of socialism, this kind of socialism, which is the kind that redistributes the wealth of human male life for the greater good of the collective, and for women like her specifically. She's a hypocrite and a coward of the highest magnitude who has no moral qualms about sending your son or your brother or your father to die for her protection. What greater wealth is there, after all, than your very life? Women like these are only concerned about socialism when it interferes with their bottom line and when it interferes with the bottom line of Team Vagina. And she's no different than Joe Biden telling men that it's up to them to, stop campus sexual assault. The implication is clear. He's telling men to jump in harm's way for women, and he's telling them that it's their duty and their moral obligation to do so, while this aging, decrepit piece of trash is accompanied everywhere he goes by a small army of Secret Service agents toting some kind of submachine gun everywhere they go. Maybe Joe Biden, maybe you should tell some of the prison guards and wardens who are actually getting paid for the safe, keyword, safe imprisonment and rehabilitation of countless male inmates to put themselves in harm's way to curb the epidemic of male rape in the prison systems, Joe. Maybe you should try that instead of telling unarmed college-age men to jump into dangerous and potentially deadly situations to defend women, while you would never, ever even think of telling women to do the same thing for us. Doesn't earn you any votes, isn't that right, Joe? That's what it boils down to. VAWA Joe Biden, having politically maneuvered himself into access to 24/7 protection from a small army, likes to sit back in his relative position of safety and tell the rest of us to put ourselves in harm's way for women we don't even know. And this is why I so thoroughly and vehemently spit on anybody, anywhere, trying to tell me that I should defend women, women that I don't know or care about. What I do is I equalize the violence that the Phyllis Schlaflys and the Joe Bidens of the world attempt to exert onto men by refusing to act in defense of any women I don't explicitly want to defend for my own personal reasons. The women in my family, they've made sacrifices for me. Therefore, I defend them if it's necessary. The women I don't know on the street somewhere, you're fucking on your own. Just like I am. And you know, to all you white knights, this is when your lizard brain kicks in. And this is the part where you tell me that, you know, I'm just like the feminist or some bullshit about not staring into the abyss lest you become part of it bullshit. Fuck your catchphrase, you go defend them. You're such a big man, you go do it. That goes to all the white knights listening, and that goes to Joe Biden, and that goes to Phyllis Schlafly, that goes to all of you hypocritical pieces of trash. But back to socialism. You know, one of the reasons that I do not trust people who have an obsessive need to find socialism anywhere and everywhere is because the only place they never seem to look for socialism is within their very own ideology. Now to be clear, socialist policies, like anything else, can most certainly be destructive. It can most certainly cause financial and social lethargy and laziness. Nobody denies this. I certainly don't. But so can an irrational and quite often selective knee-jerk aversion to these things. Because the truth is, we all of us, partake in socialism. You see, some people who bitch about the welfare state, and while it is indeed destructive, some of these same people will happily take advantage of marriage tax breaks that single men will not get. You know, and these people, they look down on those on welfare as burdens to the taxpayer, but certainly wouldn't like single men no longer having to subsidize their decision to get married and have kids by paying more of our tax dollars. This is the stay-at-home wife who feels as though she's above someone on welfare and calls them lazy, but has never worked a job in her life and depended on her husband or her father's labor her entire life. She's never known the shitty feeling of staring up at the clock, exhausted, only to discover that you're not getting out of work for another 3 hours at least. She'll never have a day. And I mean a single day of working so hard that all you do when you get home is shower, collapse in bed, wake up, and know that you have to do it all again tomorrow. She'll say, and hell, you know, even her husband might say it too, that nobody has a right to say the rich should be taxed more simply because they're better at making money, and then they'll look at you in the eye and say that women shouldn't be in the military, and they shouldn't have to sign up for selective service or fight on the front lines because men are better at soldiering, and what that really is a euphemism for is really saying that men are just better at dying for women. You know, it's this selective anti-socialism I'm talking about, where these people need to start understanding that we're all socialists and we're all capitalists. You know, what needs to be discerned is when a socialist or capitalist measure is either destructive or constructive, and we need to then employ those measures accordingly. Let's talk about Earl Silverman. Now, Earl Silverman was a man who was being abused by his wife, who tried to secure funding for a male domestic violence shelter, even saying in his own suicide note that his death is due, at least in part, to not being taken seriously on the issues surrounding services for men suffering from domestic violence. Now, let me ask you, for those coming on this channel, insinuating that because I support government funding for male domestic violence shelters, that I'm some sort of de facto criminal. You know, the all taxation is theft guys. Was Earl Silverman a socialist as well? Was Earl Silverman attempting to steal your money because he wanted some of the tax dollars that are going to be taken out of men's paychecks anyway to go to, you know, I don't know, helping men? You see, what these people fail to understand is that A, this little pipe dream you have of getting the government to stop taxing us in any capacity is exactly that. It's a pipe dream. The reason this is a pipe dream is because, again, people naturally gravitate towards systems of authority and prefer a central governing authority in place because, unfortunately, human beings crave security and safety just as much as they crave freedom and independence and are in a constant tug of war between these two fundamental human desires. This is why nation states are never really permanently abolished by their people. You know, nations and governments get overthrown and replaced. Sure they do. But usually, meet the old boss, same as the new boss, is the standard operating procedure whenever governments are overthrown for the most part. And the very word revolution that is used to describe the overthrow of a government is defined as a rotation that by very definition will bring you right back to the initial point you started at. So again, nation states are very rarely fully abolished by their people, but are always simultaneously accused of being oppressive and attempting to suppress the rights of the people, no matter how free the nation is. And this is why people like Alex Jones can talk about a globalist conspiracy to usher in a totalitarian state for, the better part of 2 decades. That's just around the corner, and people will still listen to his bullshit year after year, even though this takeover of free America or whatever never actually seems to materialize. Every year, over and over. So again, the federal US government is not going away, and taxes are not going away. And you can get mad and call everyone who tells you this a communist if you'd like, but taxes are not going away. Period. Point blank. Therefore, the next best alternative is to decide what is the most efficient way to spend tax dollars when taxation cannot be avoided, and to not tax the public when taxation isn't necessary. Because what you have to understand is that people in desperate situations will in fact reach out to a social safety net if one is in place to get back on their feet, which is exactly what I believe Earl Silverman was attempting to do. That is, to get away from his abusive wife and to get back on his feet and to dedicate his life to helping other men who are also being abused by their partners get out of that abusive situation. And, God forbid he wanted to do that by using taxpayer dollars. How horribly communist. I mean, I know. So for the record, if you want to hear it directly from my mouth, yes, if the situation were desperate enough, if I was in a position where I was unemployed and unable to find employment and homeless, just like the vast other hordes of homeless men out there, and I didn't know where my next meal was coming from, then I might consider, I know it's horribly communist to do so, I might consider getting food stamps or welfare for the first time in my life. I've never had to do it, and I hope I never will have to do it. But I'll tell you what, the last thing someone in that situation is thinking about is, well, I must be a criminal if I've ever taken advantage of a government safety net, especially when that person might be starving and homeless on the streets. And you know something, I believe that most people know that it's very possible that an unfavorable luck of the draw could have set them on the eventual path to homelessness and poverty themselves. That's why people want the comfort of that safety net in place. And we've all seen young and bright people full of potential get involved with the wrong crowd and, fall into drugs and end up on the streets. The fact is that not everyone that has a potential to succeed in a free market economy does, because sometimes it simply boils down to bad luck of the draw or whatever. And a lot of times, especially in the case of youth, and especially in the case of male youth, one bad decision that almost all of us have made, but didn't end up being disastrous for us specifically, looking back, we all know that it most certainly could have been disastrous for us. And all it takes is that one mistake to be labeled as having a criminal record or whatever. This happens to men all the time. And yes, there are people without a doubt that abuse and exploit the various social safety nets that are in place. As a matter of fact, feminism is that. I mean, that's exactly what feminism is. But there are also people, without a doubt, that genuinely need help, that are suffering from problems that simply creating more jobs or growing the economy aren't going to fix. And the vast majority of people know that it's not some incredible stretch of the imagination to know that they, or someone they care about, might end up in one of these situations. A situation perhaps like Earl Silverman's. And therefore, the vast majority of people are okay with a social safety net, and yes, I'm okay with taxation for the purposes of male domestic violence shelters. If this is theft, if this is communist or socialist, then you know what? So be it. There's a pretty good example of this very type of behavior, this very type of groupthink that's found in these ultra anti-government individuals, in how disingenuous left-wing individuals attempted to slander Ayn Rand as a hypocrite for taking government-funded health insurance after she discovered that she had lung cancer. And this was touted as some grand hypocrisy by big government liberal types. And what they did and what they said was to leave out Rand's own opinion on the matter that she penned in her own objectivist newsletter, saying, quote, and this is a commentary in reference to why, in fact, Ayn Rand justified taking that government health insurance assistance. She says, quote, "It is obvious in such cases that a man receives his own money, which was taken from him by force, directly and specifically, without his consent, against his own choice. Those who advocated such laws are morally guilty, since they assume the right to force employers and unwilling coworkers. But the victims who oppose such laws have a clear right to any refund of their own money, and they would not advance the cause of freedom if they left their money unclaimed for the benefit of the welfare state administration." End quote. Now, do I like that government is taxing me to subsidize female imperatives or unnecessary wars or anything else that I find wasteful or immoral? Well, of course not. But our response is to just what? You know, let women and warmongers have it all? I mean, realistically speaking, not a single one of these anti-government groups has the resources or even the balls to meet the United States government in open combat and make them stop taxing us. So even if you disagree that a social safety net via taxation is acceptable, even if you believe that anyone who thinks that a single taxpayer dollar being devoted towards male victims of domestic violence is wrong, there is still a suitable justification for using taxpayer dollars to fund various men's rights initiatives. Men are by far the majority of the taxpayers, and if you agree with me that the state is not going to stop taxing us, and that the best we can do is to simply decrease the amount of taxation the state is exerting on us, then we do not advance the cause of freedom for men by simply allowing the taxes forcibly collected from men by the state to go to waste. And as such, again, I support wholeheartedly any attempts to spend tax revenue on male domestic violence shelters, on male health care, on male research and development into prostate cancer, in the sciences, whatever. More to come on these topics. Thanks for listening.